Welcome back, everyone, to the Brief Insight, where we take a deep dive into complex topics.
Yeah, by looking at a variety of sources.
Exactly.
So
To uncover the most fascinating insights.
today we're going to be looking at the outcomes from COP29.
Which just wrapped up.
Yes, it was in Baku, Azerbaijan.
From November 11th to the 22nd.
So very recently.
Yeah?
Now we've got some great sources lined up for this deep dive.
We do.
Including an announcement from the UN.
Outlining some of the key agreements.
Yeah, and then a really in-depth analysis from Carbon Brief.
Always a great resource.
They are. And we even have an opinion piece on climate finance.
Interesting.
Yeah, it raises some interesting questions.
I'm looking forward to that one.
All right, so
with all of these sources, I think we can get a really well-rounded view of COP29.
I think so, too. Both the successes and, maybe where there were some disagreements or some sticking points.
Exactly. And what it all means for the future.
Okay, so let's start with that big headline from the UN announcement.
They declared a commitment to triple climate finance to developing countries.
Triple?
Yeah, reaching $300 billion annually by 2035.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of money.
It does. On the surface, it seems like a significant step forward.
It does, but I'm sure there's more to the story.
You are right about that. Our analysis from Carbon Brief suggests that developing nations were actually pushing for a much larger figure.
Oh, really? How much larger?
Yeah. So they were advocating for $1.3 trillion annually.
Wow.
And specifically coming from developed countries.
Makes sense given the, historical responsibility of industrialized nations for emissions.
Right. So how do they end up at this compromise of $300 billion?
That is a big difference.
Yeah. And what does it mean for that overall goal of $1.3 trillion?
Yeah, good questions.
Okay.
So the final agreement says that they're going to try and mobilize at least $1.3 trillion per year by 2035.
At least. Okay.
And this is key. It's from a variety of sources.
So not just developed countries.
Right. It's going to include public and private sectors.
Okay. So it seems like developed countries aren't going to be solely responsible for meeting that entire financial target.
That's how it seems, yeah.
And I imagine that probably sparked some frustration among those developing countries.
Oh, absolutely. Carbon Brief reports that countries like India and Nigeria were not happy.
Not at all.
They felt like the agreement really didn't address their needs.
Yeah.
And even that, the decision was kind of pushed through without their full consent.
Wow. So a bit of a chaotic final round of negotiations.
Sounds like it.
All of this was also happening, against the backdrop of Azerbaijan hosting the summit.
Right.
Which is a nation that's heavily reliant on fossil fuels.
Yeah. It's a little ironic, isn't it?
To say the least.
A little bit.
Yeah. Carbon Brief highlights some of the controversies that came up during the conference.
Oh, like what?
Well, there were investigations into potential conflicts of interest.
I see.
Especially regarding Azerbaijan's oil and gas industry.
I mean, I guess they're trying to walk a tightrope, right?
Right. They're trying to balance their economic interests with the goals of this climate summit.
Exactly.
It's a tough position to be in.
Yeah.
There was even a diplomatic incident where France's top climate official refused to attend the second week of negotiations.
Really?
Yeah. Citing concerns about transparency and the way the COP29 presidency was handling things.
Wow, so a lot of tension there.
Definitely. And then adding yet another layer of complexity to the entire summit.
What's that?
We had the U.S. election taking place right in the middle of COP29.
Oh, right. I'd almost forgotten about that.
And Donald Trump's victory, I can only imagine, sent shockwaves through the entire conference.
Yeah, I mean, his previous stance on climate change and his, talk of withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Agreement.
It must have caused a lot of anxiety.
A lot of uncertainty, for sure.
So did all of this completely derail the summit?
Surprisingly, no. Many countries, including China, really emphasize the importance of continued international cooperation.
Regardless of what the U.S. does.
Exactly. They were determined to keep the momentum going.
Okay, so we've got kind of a mixed bag so far.
Yeah.
We've got this tripling of climate finance, but with some, contention around it, and then this U.S. election outcome that's, added another layer of uncertainty.
Right.
So what else happened at COP29?
Well, I know Carbon Brief mentioned this long-awaited agreement on Article 6.
They did. That seemed like a pretty big deal.
Yeah. So Article 6 of the Paris Agreement focuses on carbon markets.
Okay.
And countries have been negotiating the rules for this for almost a decade.
A decade. Wow.
And finally, at COP29, they reached an agreement on the operational framework for these markets.
So can you break that down for us a little bit?
Sure.
What are carbon markets and why is this agreement so important?
Okay. So essentially, Article 6 creates this system where countries and companies can trade carbon credits.
Okay.
And these credits represent emissions reductions.
I see.
So it's meant to incentivize reducing emissions.
Okay.
So, for example,
So let's say a company exceeds their emissions target.
they could buy credits from a company that has successfully reduced their emissions below their target.
So it's like a reward system,
Exactly. You're rewarded for doing good.
and it encourages others to do the same.
Right.
But Carbon Brief also mentions some concerns about potential loopholes and a lack of transparency.
They did, yeah. There's some worry that the system could be exploited.
In what way?
Well, some experts are saying that the framework doesn't really guarantee genuine emissions reductions, and it might actually benefit companies who are just looking to offset their emissions
Right.
rather than actually changing their practices.
So greenwashing, essentially.
Potentially.
Yeah,
So it's definitely something to watch closely as these carbon markets develop.
definitely.
Yeah.
So we've got this new system in place, but we need to be very cautious about how it's implemented.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's move on to another key aspect of climate action, which is adaptation.
Okay.
Adapting to the impacts of climate change that are already happening.
Right. We can't just focus on mitigation. We have to adapt as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So did COP29 make any progress on that front?
They did. There were actually some notable advancements in the area of adaptation.
Like what?
Well, COP29 saw progress on these things called national adaptation plans,
Okay.
which are basically roadmaps for countries to enhance their resilience to climate change impacts.
Makes sense.
And there was a particular focus on supporting the least developed countries and small island developing states.
Right. They're the ones on the front lines of climate change.
Exactly. They're the most vulnerable to rising sea levels, extreme weather, all those climate-related challenges.
So it makes sense to prioritize them.
Absolutely.
But I imagine it's tricky to get everyone on the same page when it comes to adaptation strategies.
Oh, for sure. And Carbon Brief actually pointed out that disagreements arose over financing
Of course.
and a concept called transformational adaptation.
Transformational adaptation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, what is that?
So it's basically going beyond just coping with climate change.
Okay.
It's about using these challenges as opportunities to really rethink and redesign our systems.
Okay, I like that.
So, for example, instead of just building seawalls to deal with rising sea levels, transformational adaptation might involve relocating coastal communities to safer areas
Okay.
and restoring natural coastal ecosystems to provide additional protection.
So it's more proactive.
Much more proactive
Right.
and holistic.
I like that. A lot to unpack there.
Yeah, it's a big idea.
It is.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it requires a lot of resources and a willingness to really embrace some big changes.
Exactly. And that's where some of those disagreements came in during COP29. Developed countries were a little hesitant to commit to the level of funding needed for transformational adaptation,
Yeah.
while developing countries were arguing that it's absolutely essential for their long-term survival.
It's a tough situation for sure.
It is.
So it seems like another classic case of differing priorities and perspectives.
Yeah.
Did any other significant points come up during the negotiations?
Yes, a few.
Okay.
One that stands out is the failure to reach an agreement on the Just Transition Work Program.
Okay. So what is that?
So this was an initiative aimed at ensuring a fair and equitable shift to a low-carbon economy, particularly for workers and communities who are dependent on fossil fuel industries.
Yeah. That sounds like a really important part of this whole transition.
It is. It's about making sure no one is left behind.
So what were the sticking points? Why couldn't they reach an agreement?
Well, developing countries were pushing for more concrete actions and financial support to make this transition happen.
Right.
They argue that developed nations have a responsibility to help them transition to cleaner alternatives.
Given their history with fossil fuels.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
But some developed countries felt like it was too early to create a detailed work plan with funding commitments.
I see.
They said they needed more time to really assess the economic and social implications.
So more of those differing priorities.
Yeah, a lot of things left unresolved.
It seems like it. Okay. What about China? What was their role in all of this?
So China, being the world's largest annual emitter, they sent a large delegation to COP29.
And they really emphasized their commitment to international cooperation and their own efforts in the energy transition.
Okay, so they want to be seen as part of the solution.
Yes. But they also resisted pressure to contribute financially to this new climate finance goal.
So they want to collaborate, but not necessarily put their money where their mouth is.
It seems that way. Their climate envoy argued that developing nations, including China, are still facing their own development challenges
Right.
and shouldn't be burdened with these compulsory financial contributions.
Okay.
He emphasized that developed nations have that historical responsibility to lead on climate finance.
Okay, so kind of going back to that principle of common but differentiated responsibility.
Exactly.
Okay. Did China make any specific pledges or announcements at the summit?
They did. They made pledges on reducing methane emissions,
Okay.
which is a really potent greenhouse gas.
It is.
And they even launched a new satellite for methane monitoring.
Wow. So they are taking some concrete steps.
It seems so.
Yeah.
Even if they're not fully on board with the financial side of things.
Interesting. So what about other countries? What kind of international pledges and initiatives came out of COP29?
You know, there weren't as many big headline-grabbing announcements as we've seen at previous COPs.
Okay.
But there were still several initiatives and pledges made.
In what areas?
Well, a lot of them focused on practical solutions. Like there were initiatives on green grids for renewable energy transmission
Okay.
and investments in hydrogen technology.
So let's talk more action.
Kind of, yeah. But there was a noticeable lack of major new pledges on phasing out fossil fuels and addressing deforestation.
Which are pretty crucial.
They are absolutely crucial for achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement.
So it seems like a lot of the heavy lifting is going to fall on COP30,
Yeah, it looks that way.
which is happening in Brazil in 2025.
That's right.
It's going to be a big one.
It is. COP30 will be pivotal for countries to submit updated and more ambitious climate pledges.
Do we know what's on the agenda for COP30 yet?
Well, we know that Brazil, as the host, is expected to really focus on nature and biodiversity loss, which could bring a fresh perspective to the negotiations.
That's good. So it sounds like this deep dive has really highlighted the complexities of these international climate negotiations.
It has.
You know, COP29 was kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah.
We saw some progress on climate finance, but lots of disagreements and unresolved issues.
Especially regarding the role of developed countries.
Right. And then the U.S. election outcome just added another layer of uncertainty.
Definitely. And those controversies surrounding Azerbaijan didn't help.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But there were some positive developments.
There were.
You know, the agreement on Article 6 and the emphasis on adaptation.
Those were good signs.
Yeah. So I think it's easy to get bogged down in the complexities and the setbacks.
It is.
But I think it's important to maintain some optimism.
I agree.
So what are some key takeaways you think our listeners should consider?
Okay. Well, first, I think it's clear that the landscape of climate action is evolving.
What way?
Well, while these international agreements are still essential, the role of non-state actors is becoming more and more important.
Non-state actors. So you mean like businesses, cities, communities?
Exactly. And this groundswell of bottom-up action is a really positive sign.
Yeah.
It shows a broader societal shift towards sustainability.
So it's not all in governments anymore?
Not at all.
That's good to hear. What else?
I think another takeaway is that we need to move beyond simply reacting to climate change.
Okay.
We need to be more proactive.
I like that.
And that concept of transformational adaptation,
Uh-huh.
with its focus on systemic change and turning challenges into opportunities, that's something we all need to understand.
Yeah. So shifting from a mindset of just coping to one of actively shaping a better future.
Exactly.
I love that. So any final thoughts?
Well, I think COP29 might not have achieved everything we hoped for,
Right.
but it definitely showed us how urgent and complex this issue is.
Yeah.
And understanding those complexities and having informed discussions is more important than ever. And engaging in those discussions.
Exactly. So stay curious, keep learning, and continue to explore this issue.
It's a big one.
It is. So speaking of different perspectives,
Okay.
I want to bring in that opinion piece that we have from Perry Worldhouse.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they argue that maybe this whole focus on specific dollar figures for climate finance might be missing the bigger picture.
That's an interesting take.
Yeah. What do you think about that?
I think they have a point. You know, just focusing on the amount of money pledged isn't enough.
Right. It's about how that money is actually used.
Exactly. How is it delivered? How is it utilized?
And they specifically talk about the need to reform global financial institutions.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Well, like multilateral development banks, for example.
Like the World Bank.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, these institutions have a huge amount of power and influence in the global financial system.
They do.
So reforming them to align with climate goals,
That can make a big difference.
it could unlock a lot of capital for climate action.
Right. It's about using existing mechanisms more effectively.
Exactly.
It's hard.
They also point out the issue of climate finance often being delivered as loans.
Oh, yeah. Which can actually burden developing countries with even more debt.
Exactly. So it raises that question of, should this be viewed as aid
Right.
to help developing countries cope with a problem they didn't really create,
Yeah.
or is it an investment opportunity?
I mean, if it's aid, then grants and other forms of concessional finance make more sense.
Right. If it's an investment, then maybe loans are appropriate.
Yeah, it's tricky.
It's a complicated issue for sure. So what are some of the alternatives that Perry Worldhouse suggests?
Well, they propose exploring things like debt for nature swaps
Okay.
and green bonds.
I've heard of those. What are they again?
So debt for nature swaps basically allow developing countries to reduce their debt burden by committing to environmental conservation projects.
So it's like a win-win.
Exactly. And green bonds offer investors a way to directly support climate-friendly initiatives.
Okay, so basically we need to be a lot more creative and innovative in our approach to climate finance.
We do. We need to think outside the box.
Absolutely. Okay, so to wrap things up,
Yes.
COP29 was a bit of a roller coaster.
It was.
We saw some progress on climate finance, but also some disagreements,
Lots of unresolved issues.
especially regarding the role of those developed countries.
Yeah.
And then the U.S. election outcome just added to the uncertainty.
And the controversies surrounding Azerbaijan as the host.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But there were some positive developments too.
Right, like the agreement on Article 6
Yeah.
and that focus on adaptation strategies.
Exactly. So overall, a mixed bag.
For sure.
But I think it's important to remember that progress on global issues as complex as climate change,
It's rarely straightforward.
it's not. It's messy. It's challenging.
And it takes time.
It does. But COP29, even with all of its, imperfections, I think it demonstrated a continued commitment to international cooperation.
I agree.
And that's essential for tackling this global challenge.
Absolutely. We're all in this together.
We are. So that's it for our deep dive into COP29.
I hope you found it insightful.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a completely different topic.
Until then, keep learning and stay curious.
Exactly. See you next time.